Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and I'm honored to have been invited and delighted to have this opportunity to share some ideas with you. Let me begin by thanking IDSA and the Norwegian Defence Studies Institute for bringing us together and for inviting me. My topic is the emerging Sino-Iranian strategic partnership in India. A few years ago, an old friend of mine, who is a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, retired as dean of the Doha campus in Qatar, the Doha Qatar campus of Georgetown University. And my friend returned to academia, which is his true love. And since he had spent a number of years in the Persian Gulf, he invited me to participate in a research project. And since I had written about Sino-Iranian relations, and since the Iran nuclear negotiations were in the news, I said, sure, Jim, I'll undertake it. I'll join your project. And I decided to write on China and the Iran nuclear negotiations. That is, the negotiations between the P5 plus 1 plus Germany and Iran, the 7-party talks. And so I did that, and in the process I discovered something very, very interesting. China launched in the end of 2013 a high-profile, public, and fairly risky campaign of diplomacy to persuade both the Americans and the Iranians to come to terms, to persuade Iran to satisfy the concerns of the international community regarding Iran's nuclear programs. So I'm going to tell you about that finding, my research finding. But the significance of this Chinese mediation effort of the Iran nuclear issue is that I really think that it represents a substantial investment of Chinese diplomatic energy and political capital in the establishment of a new strategic partnership with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this partnership, of course, raises serious questions for India's own interest in the region. So I want to frame the question this way. My thesis, the thesis of my argument is that, in fact, we're witnessing the emergence of a new Chinese-Iranian partnership where only a very, very limited one existed before. What I propose to do is to tell you, first of all, the idea here is that Iran is emerging as an arena of political competition and rivalry between India and China. Now, we scholars are long used to looking at, say, Nepal or Myanmar or Sri Lanka as a center of pulling and tugging between India and China. I don't really think that's been the case in the past with India and with Iran, but it is emerging as an arena of India and China's rivalry. So let me review the components of the new Iran-China relationship. And then I'll review several structural factors which I think underlie the emergence of this new partnership. And then we'll review the Iran nuclear negotiations, China's role in the Iran nuclear negotiations as a foundation for this. The components of this are the components of the new Sino-Iranian partnership which has emerged recently. The first of these is the declaratory statement that China and Iran, in fact, are strategic partners. Now, if you know about Chinese foreign policy, you know that this trope, or this idea of a strategic partnership, is something that goes back to the 1960s. It goes back to the 1990s, actually. China's first strategic partnership was with the Russian Federation in 1996, and the idea was that the two countries showed a certain common interest in the emerging world. At that time, in the 90s, the common interest between Russia and China had to do with joint rejection of U.S. global unipolarity. But after that, China applied this strategy of global partners, strategic partners, to about 25 or 30 different countries, mostly mid-range countries like Mexico, Argentina, the UK, a number of the European countries and developing countries, Brazil. But interestingly, China did not apply the term strategic partnership to Iran. Now, Iran, of course, was an important Chinese partner for energy and a number of other reasons. But China used carefully constructed circumlocutions to describe the relationship. So it was a comprehensive cooperative partnership, but not a strategic partnership. I think the reason China avoided strategic partnership was that a strategic partnership implies a level of commitment that China was not willing to undertake in the case of Iran. A strategic partner implies a certain level of commitment to a country's security, support for the country in the event of a confrontation, for example, with the United States. But China carefully avoided the use of the term strategic partner until Xi Jinping's visit in January 2016. Interestingly, so Xi Jinping was the first foreign leader to visit Tehran after the full implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And interestingly, the second foreign leader to visit Iran was Narendra Modi, who also proclaimed the establishment of an Indo-Iranian strategic partnership, a formula which India and Iran had used back in an earlier attempt at rapprochement or partnership back in 2001-2003 timeframe. So this symbolic shift in the label applied to the relationship, to the China-Iranian relationship. Another aspect of the new Iranian-Chinese partnership is military cooperation. The PLA Navy, of course, entered the Indian Ocean for the first time in 1985, when a Chinese destroyer and replenishment ship called it Karachi, then Chittagong, and Colombo. Thereafter, between 1985 and 2009, Chinese warships would enter the Indian Ocean once every couple of years. Once a small squad, usually a destroyer and a replenishment ship, would enter the Indian Ocean. And according to a study done by the U.S. Navy War College, so they entered every couple of years. What happened is in 2009, China decided to join the International Anti-Piracy Coalition in the Gulf of Aden, and starting January 2009, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy was permanently in the Indian Ocean. China would rotate its ships through the Indian Ocean, rotate its crews through the Indian Ocean, rotate its officers through the Indian Ocean, gaining deep operational knowledge about the environment there. But Chinese warships did not call at Iran. According to this study by the U.S. Naval War College, they visited Chinese warships, visited maybe 25 ports all around the Indian Ocean littoral, except for Iran. They conspicuously avoided Iran until September 2014. By September 2014, the Iran nuclear negotiations were gaining speed. President Rouhani was already been elected in Iran. The secret talks between the United States and Iran in Muscat, Oman were well underway. So the Iran nuclear negotiations are moving towards a much more likely to reach a successful conclusion. And it was in that environment that China decided to initiate military relations with Iran. In the joint communique signed between Xi Jinping and Hassan Rouhani in January this year, the two sides provided that areas of expanded cooperation would be in military, security, including military-to-military, joint training, exchange of equipment, and joint exercises. So the China-Iranian partnership is in the military dimension, security dimension, really for the first time. Again, I think China eschewed that type of cooperation before because it was too dangerous. Had Iran then gotten itself into a conflict with, say, Israel and or the United States, and China had given Iran a certain degree of support, and China done nothing, it would have lost credibility, both with Iran, who would see the United States, seeing China as a paper tiger, and with other potential allies. So rather than assume that risk and responsibility, China avoided that until the vista looked pretty good for the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal. Another component, I'm sorry, because I apologize for my bad eyes, but another component of the new China-Iranian partnership has to do with the connectivity issues that Foreign Secretary Jai Shankar was just talking about. One Belt, One Road, enunciated by Xi Jinping in October 2013. This is a big deal. We're talking about China has several $1 trillion of foreign currency invested largely in U.S. treasuries, and China has decided to take several $100 billion of that and use it to build the connectivity throughout Eurasia, drawing regions of Eurasia all the way in Europe, through the Eastern Med, through the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, South Asia, to connect these vast regions with China. And Iran has agreed, this was part of the agreement between Xi Jinping and Rouhani in January this year. Iran has agreed to play a role in the One Belt, One Road. Now this isn't new. China began developing railways in Iran in 1993, actually shortly after the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And China has been a major partner for Iranian railway development and highway development ever since. So in a way, this is a rebranding. But you know, one other area that China has carefully avoided in Iran is the construction of new seaports. We all know about the String of Pearls, these large-scale new ports and harbors that China has built all the way financed and built all around the Indian Ocean littoral. But again, except for Iran. But again, the Rouhani-Xi joint communique of January this year specifies that harbor development, harbor and port infrastructure is to be a new area of concentration. You know, the advantage of Iran as a partner, as a terminal, Indian Ocean terminus, for the logistic partner, the connectivity partner for China, and doesn't like the United States enough to tell the Americans no and continue supporting China in a crisis, Iran might be your best bet. Iran might be China's best bet. So this is the latent geopolitical context that Iranian participation in China's connectivity efforts is significant. And remember the amount of money we're talking about, $25 billion given recently to Bangladesh, not given, but lent to Bangladesh. $46 billion to Pakistan for the China-Pakistan economic corridor. We're talking about a country which has deep pockets, is able to think big, able to think strategically, and think about pulling regions of Eurasia into its economic gravity over decades hence. And Iran has agreed to be a partner in that process. Okay, several structural factors that are underlying this. One is structural factor. The structural factors which are pushing Iran and China together, pulling Iran and China together. The first is the rise of China as a significant power, maybe as a major power in the Indian Ocean, South Asian region. The entry and presence, the permanent presence, and may I say the growing presence of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean, that's a big deal. Remember, the Chinese Navy was not into the Indian Ocean until 1985, and not that permanently until 2009. China has built itself a modern blue water navy since 1995. That's a big deal. And China needs partners and cooperative partners in the Indian Ocean area, and Iran promises to be one of those. A couple of inflection points here. Over the last decade or so, China has decided it needs a more proactive, more assertive policy to use China's growing power to protect its growing interests and to shape the regional environment in a way that comports with China's own interests. The two inflection points were the a strategic evaluation of the Western economic crisis of 07-08. And this was a debate, academic debate, which reached a conclusion. And the idea was that the balance of comprehensive national power between China and the West, led by the United States, had shifted fundamentally, and China was in a much more stronger position and should use its greater power in a more proactive fashion. The second shifting point was Xi Jinping's assumption of paramount leader in the end of 2012, and Xi came to power determined to use nationalism to mobilize support for his regime and for his leadership. and enunciated the vision of the great dream of the Chinese people, of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation to the standard of esteem in the international sphere that they long had and rightfully enjoyed, but which had been lost because of the predations of the imperialist powers. This type of rhetoric is very powerful, and she enunciated this, but of course to back up the rhetoric you have to have forceful action. So China's increasing demonstration of its power in the Indian Ocean region is, to my mind, a function of the growing, in part, a function of the growing nationalism which inspires and legitimizes China's government. Another structural factor, again, a structural factor which is pulling China and Iran together, is the recession of U.S. power. I'm not sure recession is the right word. The disengagement of U.S. power. I don't believe that U.S. power, I don't believe that the United States is in decline. I don't believe, but it's not a question of the decline of U.S. power. It's a question of a decision by the U.S. government not to use its power in a particular way. And the U.S. government under Barack Obama decided not to use U.S. power any longer, to isolate Iran and pressure Iran to bring it to terms over its nuclear programs. Rather, the Obama administration decided to reach a compromise with Iran over its nuclear program. And what that meant was that the United States basically agreed through the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that Iran had a right, which the U.S. long resisted, a right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy under the provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the United States agreed to the full lifting of international sanctions. So these were policy decisions of the U.S. government which in effect removed U.S. power from the regulation of both China and India's relations with Iran. Now, that's a mouthful. Previously, starting Iran's clandestine nuclear actions or programs were discovered around 2003, remember. And after that, from 2003 all the way to the conclusion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, the United States used its still immense power to persuade countries around the world, especially major oil consumers like China, like India, not to engage with Iran. And in fact, both India and China acceded to American policy. Basically, the choice that confronted both China and India was, do you want to develop relations with the United States or with Iran? And both the Indian and Chinese governments decided that relations with Iran outweighed the relations relations with the United States outweighed the relations with India. The first Indian-Iranian strategic entente, or strategic partnership, came in April 2001, that is several months before the 9/11 attacks in the United States, when Atal Bahar Vajpayee, as Prime Minister, visited Iran. And the two sides, with Vajpayee's visit, proclaimed a strategic partnership. The crux of that were two. One, Caspian energy, getting Caspian energy to the sea, and two, stabilizing or dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan. But this was an Iranian-Indian strategic partnership, which culminated 2 years later when President Mohammad Khatami visited India. So basically, India and Iran were moving towards a partnership, but this was just at the juncture when when India was moving towards its new strategic partnership with the United States, and the Indian government had to decide whether it wanted to develop a new strategic partnership with the United States or develop a strategic partnership with Iran. And they came down on the side of partnership with the United States, and India disengaged from partnership with Iran. And it's interesting, when Narendra Modi visits Tehran again this year in May 2016, the same two things: Afghanistan, Chabahar, the Chabahar to Afghanistan corridor, and the Caspian energy with cooperation with Russia and Iranian transit are the same things. Basically, what happened is that India puts its partnership with Iran on ice to develop the new strategic partnership with the United States. China did likewise. The United States, actually, the Iran issue has been a major factor in the China-U.S. relations since 1979. And every U.S. president has basically demanded China do this, and this regarding Iran. And as the international concerns over Iran's clandestine nuclear programs mounted in the 2000s after 2003, the United States put more and more sanctions on, led the international community to impose more and more sanctions on Iran. And China also had to decide whether to go for another step in partnership with Iran, which it ardently desired to do, or disengage for the sake of better relations with the United States. And China's decision was basically the same as India. China's stakes in its relationship with the United States were heavier than China's stakes in its relationship with Iran. So the U.S. uses power to regulate both China's and Iran's policy relations with Iran. But with the Obama policy, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with the successful conclusion of this nuclear deal, the United States withdrew its power, and both China and India are now able to develop relations with Iran on the basis of their own national interests without regard to making the United States unhappy. So, I think that it's sort of like, I'm a student of Chinese foreign relations, it's sort of like the shift in U.S. policy in October 1971 when China entered the General Assembly of the United Nations. Remember that before then, for 30 years, the United States had used its immense power to persuade countries around the world to support for the Republic of China, Taiwan seat in the General Assembly. But once the United States shifted its policy and it became known, Kissinger's first secret visit to Beijing was in July 71, and then his second public visit was in October 71, while the debate at the United Nations over the China question was underway. And once it became clear that the United States would not use its power to deter countries from voting for China in the UN, the dam broke, and the countries acted on the basis of their own interest. I think that the shift in U.S. policy under Obama was sort of similar. So it's not that U.S. power declined, but it's that the U.S. made a deliberate decision not to no longer engage its power to limit Iran's relations with China and India. And lo and behold, China and India rush forward pell-mell to go as fast as they can. The third structural factor, and I'll just mention this, is Iran's rise. Now, Iran, of course, views itself as the rightful historic big brother in the Persian Gulf. Iran is an ancient nation. It's a capable nation. It's a proud nation. It views itself as a great civilization, a great. Iran has built almost as many great empires over history as the Chinese have. The Achaemenid, the Safavid, the Abbasid, the Sasanian, great empires, vast region. And Iran has a powerful nationalism as far as today. Remember the Shah. The Shah's policy, supported by the United States, was that the Shah was Iran was going to become the policeman of the Gulf. Now comes the Islamic Revolution. There's also a sense of mission, but it's really not fair to call the Islamic Revolution nationalist. Khomeini was no nationalist. He was a religious fanatic. But after Khomeini, when the mellowing of the Islamic Revolution, Iran has become maybe more normal great power, and they desire primacy in the Gulf. And they're making a good shot at getting it. When they look at Iran's role in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, now Yemen, and a rising, all powers need allies. All powers need allies. And when Iran looks around the region for countries that are likely to be allies, China is a good bet. China has substance, it has capability. Of course, there's Russia. But if you look at Iranian history, look at Persian history, it's not likely the Persians are going to choose Russia as an ally. Russia is a partner of an expedience. You look at the history of Russian aggression against Persia going back to the 18th century. It's not likely to be Russia. China has never come into conflict with Iran. China and Iran have a long tradition of partnership. Today, China and Iran share very similar views about the world. So in terms of a rising Iran coming close to reaching its aspirations of preeminence in the Gulf, they look for partners, and China's right there. China has capabilities, it has deep pockets. India also is a potential partner, but India bears the albatross of a positive relation with the United States. And you can be sure that in this competition between New Delhi and Beijing for influence in Tehran, China will find ways to insinuate to Iran's leaders that India's relations with the United States make India an unreliable partner, less reliable than China, who after all shares with Iran the repugnant views of American hegemonism, American dominance, and so forth. Several times over the course of Iranian-Chinese relations, Iran has proposed to China some type of united front against the Americans. The Chinese have always said no, thank you. Actually the Chinese said, well, it's an interesting idea. Let's study it. But the offers are on the table. The offers are on the table. Okay, finally, the joint comprehensive. The China's role in the Iran nuclear negotiations. What happens is this. How much time do I have? 2 or 3 hours? Oh, 20 minutes. Okay, good. 3 minutes.
15 minutes.
What happens is this. One of China's leading Iran experts, a man who, as a young student in his 20s, was selected by Zhou Enlai to be one of the first Chinese to study Farsi. This was after the Bandung Conference, in which Chinese diplomats came into contact with a lot of third world speakers and realized they didn't have the linguistic talent. So Zhou Enlai ordered that a cohort of bright young people be selected, and one of the young men that was selected chose to study Farsi and was the first person to study Farsi at Beijing University. Later, he entered the Foreign Service and served in the Foreign Ministry a number of postings. He was posted also, his first Farsi-speaking post was in Afghanistan in the early 1960s under the monarchy. And he had a great time. He enjoyed Afghanistan immensely, and he had a lot to say about the condition of Afghanistan at that time. Later, he was posted to Iran under the Shah, and he was in Iran in 1977, 78, 79, and walked around Iran and watched the revolution. He later went back to Iran as China's ambassador to Iran. This guy's name was Hua Liming. After Ambassador Hua retired from the Chinese diplomatic service, he wrote an article. It was published in the Academic Journal of the Foreign Ministry in 2006, 国际问题研究, in 2006. And in this article, Ambassador Hua argued that China's policy of balancing between Tehran and Washington didn't really serve China's interest. It was suboptimal. By balancing this way, the Americans thought the Chinese were playing a double game, and really the Americans thought the Chinese was trying to strengthen Iran against China. And the Iranians thought China was a paper tiger because they said they support him, but then they really didn't. So China's policy was subfunctional. It's not working right. On the other hand, Ambassador Hua argued it's inevitable that the Americans and the Iranians will get together sooner or later. Look at all these interests they have in common, and they like each other. And it's interesting. Ambassador Hua's conclusion for this was that he had a lot of schmoozing with the leaders of the the Islamic Republic of Iran, and none of them said, it's a pity we can't work with the Americans. And anyway, and then China had good relations with both Iran and the United States. So what Hua proposed was that China mediate the Iran-U.S. confrontation. China used its good offices to mediate between Iran and the United States. This was in 2006, after Hua had retired from the foreign ministry. Now what happened, I talked to Ambassador Hua about this, and he said, I asked him what became of the article, and he said nothing, nobody paid any attention to it. So basically, I asked him if the foreign ministry knew about it. So, they knew about it. But it was, outside the envelope, too radical, too bizarre, too outside of what Chinese policy was, until Xi Jinping comes to power. Remember I said before that Xi Jinping comes to power at the end of 2012, and he says, we need a more assertive policy, we need a more proactive policy, a policy to shape the international environment. And I think what happened was that it came down to the foreign ministry and said, the boss wants a more proactive policy. So they pulled over the fire cabinet and said, here's this proposal for a mediation effort. They pulled it out and dusted it off and put it into implementation. And it's interesting, in the end of 2013, when this policy is finally implemented, the main advocate, defender, and spokesperson for this policy, now retired, a think tank professor, is Ambassador Hua Liming. Anyhow, so this mediation effort comes into operation in late 2013. Starts at a high level. Xi Jinping meets with Rouhani and says, we're going to settle a comprehensive settlement. It's public. I counted between late 2013 and the conclusion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in July 2016. I counted 17 times Chinese diplomats lobbied Iranian diplomats to do what was necessary to meet the concerns of the international community over Iran's nuclear programs. And to the Americans, that was 17 times towards Iran. Toward the Americans, the Chinese are saying comprehensive permanent action, solve the issue now, forever. So China was using its good offices with Tehran and Washington to bring this issue to conclusion. China has a lot of leverage with Iran. There was in December 2014. This is right before there's in 2015. The things that happened. They did still no deal, but at that juncture, the Chinese ambassador to Iran, a guy named Pang Lin, host a meeting of the Iranian-Chinese Friendship Association. So this is the Chinese ambassador speaking to the Chinese-Iranian Friendship Association. The session is co-hosted by a vice foreign minister of Iran. And Ambassador Pang starts with a lot of civilizational rhetoric, which you Indians and Iranians and Chinese like to talk about, so ancient societies and so forth. So he has, get the atmosphere right with it with civilizational rhetoric. And then he says, Ambassador Pang says this: friends, we Chinese are prepared to help Iran do a lot of good things. We're prepared to help with your urbanization, with your industrialization, with your infrastructure development, with your energy. We're prepared to help Iran become a modern country. But you must understand that a settlement of the Iran nuclear issue is a prerequisite for this. Now this was a public audience, but I assume the same message is being played in private. So China was using its both carrots and sticks to bring Iran to terms. It did the same with the Americans. Why China did this? China did this not because of the goodness of its heart, because it concluded that if it didn't, the likely result was going to be war. If there was not a negotiated settlement of the nuclear issue, Israel was likely to attack. The Americans would more probably be drawn in. So the perspective, the situation from China's point of view was a negotiated settlement or a war, and a war would be immensely damaging to China's own interests. That was the most important level. But the second level, this partnership settlement, a comprehensive permanent settlement of the nuclear issue, would open the way, as it did open the way, to expanded cooperation between Iran and China. So from the Chinese perspective, from the Iran perspective, the Sino-Iranian relationship is open, the door is open, the way is cleared. The two sides are committed to an expanded partnership, and this is a new element of the geopolitical geography that confronts India. Thank you very much.